The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was developed in a year. The Wind Waker HD was done in about 9 months. But what about BS Zelda? To explain why I'm even considering this notion in the first place, let's flash back to the early days of BS Zelda ROM hacksing. Back when BS Zelda was first ROM dumped, there was a hack called the Roto Complete patch, which basically let Z-SNES users play the game. Once they got in this room though, it was all like, whoa, what is that weird glitchy thing doing here? Wah! The mystery of this placeholder data for a boss plagued the community for years. The ROM dump of BS Zelda currently circulating is from Episode 3, whereas that boss was only in a location accessible in Episode 4, it thus took many years for us to figure out that the blue manhandler was supposed to be there. But seeing the rest of that data available, why would that be missing? Unless the game was not even done by the time Episode 3 was sent to St.GIGA? That, I admit, is nothing but speculation. And while my hyperbolic mind would like me to believe that the game is literally being coded as it was broadcast, that's probably not very likely. But there are several things that make me think that BS Zelda was developed on a much shorter time span than a typical Zelda game. I'll talk about a few of the reasons I think about in this video. I admit, these probably are not conclusive of anything, but I think this would open up a nice place to discuss and research this subject. I'm starting with a bit more about the actual game's programming. Well, besides what was already talked about. Prior to making this video, I tried looking up info on BS Zelda's development history on various websites, but mostly came up empty. Wikipedia's citations in particular are full of dead links. Ugh. But anyway, I did look up this Nintendo Power interview with Makoto Sasaki. The last 2 lines of this interview in particular interest me. A difficult programming project. The strain was incredible. The goal was to have no interactive lag. Oops? Or programming bugs. Mr. Sasaki, I'm sincerely sorry. But at the end of the day, small bugs are not a big deal. What's more off-putting to me about the coding of BS Zelda is basically how it doesn't really feel like NES Zelda at all when you get right down to it. I mean, sure, superficially it looks like an updated version, but pay attention to how the sword swings, or how its collision detection works. Look at how the player character wraps around a block as he goes down, instead of getting stuck on it like an NES Zelda. Check the differences in certain enemy behaviors, especially the fact that the Dongo can't be killed with a single bomb in any way possible. And how about the size of the boomerang and bombs? Oh, and the fairies too, yeah. In comparison to the ports of Mario games in Super Mario All-Stars, which played pretty similarly besides the obvious intentional changes, BS Zelda felt more like a game that was recoded by people who forgot some of the details of how the mechanics of NES Zelda worked. And then, in attempting to replicate them, the game somehow mutated into being something more like its own thing entirely. This is why I'd like to argue that BS Zelda is not a remake of NES Zelda by the standards of what Nintendo would consider a remake. The mechanics quite simply don't match up. It's as different as New Super Mario Bros. Is to NES Mario Bros. Lately, Nintendo has become known for surprise launches of games shortly after the announcement of their existence. But before then, they did that with BS Zelda. The first announcement about the game was published on Famitsu on July 21st, 1995, with information and screenshots coming just a week later. The game was set to start broadcasting in August, the following month. That's a very short time frame between announcement and release. Sounds kinda similar to how Nintendo handles their eShop releases. By the way, take a look at the screenshots. Then compare and contrast how they actually look in the game. Quite different, huh? Some different colors, some different graphics here and there. Everything just feels slightly off. And while many people believe these are prototype screenshots, why would you have prototype screenshots that look so different from the final game when it's mere weeks from release? Even I can't think out of a good answer to that question, and quite frankly, it seems unlike Nintendo in general. And when Nintendo is not being Nintendo, something strange is happening. Very strange. Speaking of things that are strange for Nintendo, let's check out the Soundlink audio.
赤い指輪は迷いの森の近くにポツンと立った石像の下。パワーブレスレットが必要だ。
Shut it, Jubei, you're wrong! There is absolutely no requirement to have the power bracelet in order to obtain the red ring whatsoever! And knowing this is pretty important for my single episode challenge run. One of the most un-Nintendo-like things I can think of is misdirecting the player with inaccurate information. Yet this slipped into BS Zelda. Another thing about the Soundlink that makes me think it was put together pretty quickly was the backstory used as the introduction. Or rather, how it was basically just a paraphrased version of the Link to the Past's backstory. Which doesn't even make sense when you consider that this is supposed to be NES Zelda? I know Miyamoto likes to say they're just the same story told in a different way, but that's going overboard with it. I feel as though many of the things I pointed out sound like they would fit the narrative of a game being rushed to market and having some elements overlooked. Thankfully, BS Zelda is still a really excellent game, but considering that, imagine what a few extra months of polish could have done. Obviously, the error in the Soundlink could have been fixed. Maybe Blue Manhandla could have been Gleeok instead. Maybe there could have been a real level 9. Or maybe the code could have been prepared for a cartridge release. Especially, you know, that one Nintendo Power tease that could have come out in America so we could probably play this game? On the other hand, if BS Zelda wasn't a rush game, then what would cause some of the issues that I pointed out? The game code, the Soundlink, and the promotional material all have separate and distinct issues. Perhaps Mr. Sasaki has those answers. If only I could talk to him someday. Or perhaps one of you commenters has those answers. Anyone want to comment? I always forget that E3 is total procrastination time for me. Have you been enjoying all the announcements? Ooh, there's been quite a few megatons launched so far. I'm pretty partial to Earthbound Beginnings. It gives me a lot of hope for BS Zelda.